The Grand Central Station was a beast that never slept. It breathed in commuters with every arriving train and exhaled them out into the city with a frantic, steady rhythm. The air was thick with the smell of damp concrete, cheap coffee, and the faint, metallic tang of electricity from the tracks below. 1,000 conversations blurred into a single roaring hum, punctuated by the shriek of breaking metal and the robotic voice of announcements echoing off the marble wall's dot in the middle of this organized chaos. Tucked between a shuttered newsstand and a pillar plastered with faded ads stood the piano. It was an old, upright thing, its dark wood scarred with years of use. A small, handwritten sign on its music stand simply said, "Play me." Most people rushed past it without a glance, too focused on their phones, their schedules, their own little worlds. It was a piece of street furniture, a relic from a slower time. He arrived like a shadow, without a sound that could be heard over the station's din. A man in his late 40s, maybe early 50s, dressed in a plain gray coat that had seen better days. His shoes were practical but worn, scuffed at the toes. He carried nothing, no briefcase, no laptop bag, no fancy coffee cup. His hands were buried deep in his pockets, and his shoulders were slightly hunched, as if carrying a weight only he could feel. His face was ordinary. It was the kind of face you would forget minutes after seeing it. Tired eyes, a day or two of stubble, lines etched around his mouth that spoke less of laughter and more of quiet endurance. He moved slowly through the river of people, not fighting the current, but letting it flow around him. To anyone who might have briefly made eye contact, he was just another man, worn down by life, maybe a tired office worker, a struggling teacher, someone who had missed his train. They would have been so very wrong. This man, in another life, in another world that existed just a click away on the screens everyone was staring at, was Leo Thorne. He had built Ether, not from a shiny garage, but from a messy dorm room, with code that dreamed of connecting people. It had grown into a digital empire, a network that touched billions. He had been a king in that world, his face on magazine covers, his every word analyzed. But that man seemed like a ghost to him now, a character from a story someone else had lived. A year ago, the music in his life had stopped. His wife, his partner, his best friend, had passed away after a sudden, cruel illness. The world of Ether, with its constant notifications and digital cheers, felt like a cruel joke. The connections there felt thin, weightless. He had stepped back, disappearing from public view, leaving his company in the trusted hands of his team. The billionaire vanished, and in his place was just a man with a hollowed-out heart and a question that gnawed at him in the quiet of his empty house. The question was this: was it real? All of it? The emotions people shared online, the communities formed in comment sections, the curated lives. Was any of it as real as a shared glance, a touch on the arm, a tear witnessed by a stranger? Or had they all, himself as the chief architect included, built a beautiful, noisy cage that actually kept them apart? He had spent his life connecting people through fiber optic cables and algorithms. But he wondered if he'd made them forget how to connect through something as simple as a shared moment of beauty, or sadness, or silence. This piano, this chipped and lonely instrument in the middle of the rushing crowd, was his test. It was a ridiculous experiment, born of grief and a desperate, fragile hope. He would be the anonymous variable. The music would be the trigger. The people, the unsuspecting, busy, beautiful people of the city, would be the answer. He wasn't here to play a famous sonata or show off. He was here to offer a piece of his own raw, unedited heart and see if, in the real world, without a profile picture or a username, it would mean anything to anyone. He stood for a long moment just watching the piano. A teenage boy had banged out a chaotic, energetic rock tune on it an hour before. An old man had slowly picked out the melody of chopsticks. Now it sat silent, waiting. The man in the gray coat Leo finally took a slow, deep breath. The station's noise seemed to fade into a distant roar, like ocean waves heard from inside a shell. He pulled his hands from his pockets. They were slender, with long fingers, a pianist's hands or a coder's hands. He pulled out a single item, a small, creased photograph, its corners soft from touch. It showed a woman with a kind, smiling face, her head thrown back in laughter, the sun lighting her hair. He looked at it for a heartbeat, his own face softening for the first time, a flicker of unbearable love and pain in his eyes. He tucked it carefully into the breast pocket of his coat, right over his heart. Then he sat down in the worn piano stool. It gave a faint squeak. He adjusted it slightly, his movements slow and deliberate. He didn't crack his knuckles or make a show of it. He simply opened the fallboard, revealing the yellowed keys. Some were chipped. A few of the black keys had small cracks. It was imperfect. It was real. He placed his fingers lightly on the cool ivory. He closed his eyes, not for dramatic effect, but to listen to the station, to the life rushing around him, to the echo of his own memories. He thought of his wife's voice. He thought of the silence in his house. He thought of the thousands of faces streaming past him, each with their own silent battles, their own hidden joys. His shoulders sank, the last bit of tension leaving them. He wasn't Leo Thorne, billionaire, here. He was just a man, missing another person, sitting at a public piano. The first note he played was a single middle C. It was clean, but the old piano gave it a slight, mournful vibration. He let it hang in the air, a simple statement in the complex noise of the station. A few people glanced over, annoyed at the interruption to their mental soundtrack of worries and to-do lists. Then he played a second note, A-G, creating a quiet, open interval. It was neither happy nor sad. It was a question. A young woman in a puffy coat, dragging a heavy suitcase, slowed her march toward the long-distance train gates. The sound had cut through her anxiety about going home for the first time in years. He added his left hand, a slow, walking bass note that felt like a heartbeat. Then, with his right, he began a simple, descending pattern of chords. They were original, something he'd been fiddling with in the quiet hours of the night. The melody was hesitant, searching. It was the sound of a foggy morning, of walking alone on an empty beach, of looking at an old photo and feeling both the warmth and the cold absence. The music was not flashy. It wasn't designed to impress. It was honest. It was the sound of a man quietly unpacking his grief, note by note, in a public space. A security guard, leaning against a wall, bored out of his mind after a 6-hour shift, straightened up a little. His eyes, which had been glazed over, focused on the man at the piano. The tune reminded him of something he couldn't name, a feeling from long ago. The man at the piano played on, his eyes still closed. He was somewhere else now, somewhere between the station and his memory. His fingers, guided by muscle memory and deep emotion, began to weave in a tiny fragment of a lullaby his wife used to hum. It was just 3 notes, tucked into the chord progression, a ghost of a melody. An elderly man sitting on a bench, waiting for a friend, stopped fiddling with his watch. He looked up, his brow furrowed. Those 3 notes. They were from a song his own mother used to sing, a song he hadn't thought of in 50 years. A sudden, unexpected tightness gripped his throat. The snow was beginning to fall. Not the music, not yet. That was just the first few flakes. But the people, they were the snow. One by one, they were stopping. They were turning. They were listening. Not because they knew who was playing, but because what was playing was speaking directly to a hidden corner of their own hearts. The experiment, in its first fragile minutes, had begun. The man in the gray coat, alone in a crowd of thousands, had asked his silent question with a chord. And now the station, slowly, and without yet knowing it, was beginning to form an answer. The music didn't shout. It whispered. And in the roaring cavern of the train station, a whisper, if it's honest enough, can be the most powerful sound of all. The man in the gray coat had lost himself in the flow of his own fingers. The simple, searching chords had found a direction. They began to swell, just a little, like a story gaining confidence. The melody he was weaving wasn't from a songbook. It was a conversation between his past and his present. A phrase of deep blue sorrow would be answered by a higher, lighter sequence of notes that sounded like remembering a good dream. It was the sound of someone working something out, right there in front of everyone. Over by the coffee kiosk, a young woman in her 20s had been staring at her phone, her thumb scrolling endlessly through a social media feed. She was supposed to be studying for her final exams, but the words on her screen had stopped making sense hours ago. A knot of panic about her student loans, her future, her worth, was tied tightly in her chest. The first few piano notes had just been background noise, but as the music settled into its rhythm, her scrolling slowed. She looked up. The melody seemed to mirror the heavy, anxious feeling in her own heart. But there was something else in it, too, a kind of patience. It didn't make her feel worse. It made her feel seen. She put her phone in her pocket, the screen going dark. For the first time all day, she took a full, deep breath, her shoulders dropping as she leaned against a pillar to listen. On a bench nearby, an older man with a neat, trimmed beard checked his wristwatch for the third time in a minute. He was waiting for a friend from his army days, a reunion planned for months. He was excited, but an old, familiar sadness had crept in all morning. So many of their old squad were gone now. The past felt more real than the present. The piano music drifted over to him. It had a certain cadence to it, a rhythmic marching quality in the left hand that was subtle but there. It wasn't a military tune, but it carried that same feeling of moving forward under a weight. And the right hand, those higher, lonely notes. They sounded like the echoes from a long time ago, memories you could almost touch but couldn't quite hold. He stopped looking at his watch. He just stared at the floor, listening, his jaw working slightly. A young mother, looking exhausted, was trying to bounce a fussy baby in a sling against her chest. The baby was making those grating, tired cries that wear down a person's soul. She was pacing, shushing, feeling utterly alone in the middle of the crowd. She turned a corner, aiming for a quieter hallway, and the wall of sound from the station hit her first. But then, cutting through it, came the piano. It was calm. It was steady. Unlike the jarring noises of the station, this sound was smooth, like a river. Almost without thinking, she stopped her frantic pacing. She started swaying in time with the music, a slow, gentle rock. The baby's cries hiccuped, softened, and then faded into a few whimpers. The mother closed her eyes, resting her cheek against her baby's head, swaying to the stranger's lullaby. A single tear of relief rolled down her cheek, and she didn't even bother to wipe it away. The crowd around the piano was growing, but it was a strange kind of crowd. No one pushed. No one spoke. They just gathered. A delivery man in a bright orange vest, holding a paper-wrapped sandwich he'd forgotten to eat, stood frozen. A pair of teenage girls, who had been laughing and taking selfies, fell quiet, their smiles fading into looks of thoughtful confusion. An elderly woman with a wheeled shopping cart parked it carefully and sat on its edge, her hands folded in her lap. They were from every walk of life, every age, every background. They were a mosaic of the city itself, and they were all, for their own private reasons, being drawn into the same emotional space. The man playing had no idea. His eyes were shut tight. He was far away, in a memory of a sunlit kitchen, of his wife dancing to a song on the radio, her socks slipping on the tiles. He smiled a small, private smile as his fingers played a lighter, quicker run of notes. The sound of that slippy dance dot, the music shifted again. The tentative hope in the melody grew stronger, bolder. It built upwards, climbing like someone finding their footing on a steep hill. Then, at what felt like a peak, it paused. Just for a second. The only sound was the distant rumble of a train, and the hum of the station dot into that pause. From the edge of the gathering came another sound. It was a low, sweet, questioning note from a violin. A young man with a shock of curly hair and a worn case strapped to his back had been weaving through the station, looking for a good spot to busk. He'd heard the piano from across the concourse and had been drawn like everyone else. He wasn't a famous musician. He played on street corners for spare change, fighting the noise of the city with his strings. He heard the soul in what the man at the piano was doing. He heard the space left in the music, an invitation he felt in his bones dot as the piano began its next phrase. Softer now, the young man swiftly and quietly unlatched his case. He lifted out his violin and tucked it under his chin in one fluid motion. He didn't ask for permission. He didn't make a show of it. He simply listened for 2 more bars, his head cocked, his bow hovering. Then, as the piano melody began to repeat its hopeful climb, the violinist joined in. He didn't play the same melody. He played an answer to it, a harmony that wrapped around the piano notes like a vine around an old tree. It was a supporting line, gentle and respectful, but it filled the air, making the sound twice as rich, twice as deep. The violin's voice was human, a breathy, crying sound that spoke directly to the heart. The effect on the crowd was electric. A soft, collective gasp seemed to move through them. This was no longer a solo performance. It was a conversation, a duet between 2 strangers who had never met. The man at the piano heard it. His eyes flickered open for just a second, surprised. He saw the violinist from the corner of his eye, gave the tiniest, almost imperceptible nod, and then closed his eyes again. A new layer of emotion crossed his face. Gratitude. He wasn't alone in this experiment anymore. Together, the piano and violin began to explore. The music became a story told by 2 voices. It would swell with something that felt like shared pain, then break into a passage of incredible, fragile beauty. You could hear the storm and the calm after the storm. You could hear loneliness, and then you could hear the hand reaching out in the dark. The older man on the bench was now openly crying, tears cutting clean lines through the wrinkles on his face. He wasn't sobbing. He was just releasing. The music was a key, turning in a lock he'd kept shut for years. The young student had slid down the pillar to sit on the floor, her knees drawn up to her chest. She was hugging her legs, her face wet. The knot in her chest was loosening, unraveling note by note. For the first time in months, she didn't feel alone in her fear. The security guard had taken off his hat and was holding it over his heart, his professional detachment completely gone. He was just a man now, moved by something beautiful. The snowstorm had arrived. Not one person in that growing circle was untouched. They were caught in a shared experience that felt more real, more immediate than anything they'd felt in a long time. Phones stayed in pockets. Trains were missed. The outside world, with its schedules and demands, simply ceased to exist. In that busy train station, they had, all without planning it, stepped into a church made of sound. And the man in the gray coat, the billionaire who felt like a ghost, was playing the hymn. The duet between the piano and the violin wove a kind of magic in the air. It was no longer just music you heard with your ears. You felt it in your chest, in the back of your throat. The space around the old piano had become a bubble, a quiet pocket in the roaring station. Inside it, Time moved differently. Dot, the man at the piano, had surrendered completely to the moment. The violinist's unexpected partnership had unlocked something in him. It was as if he'd been speaking a painful, private truth in a language only he knew, and suddenly someone else had understood and started speaking it back to him. His playing deepened. The chords became richer, more confident. He began to weave in fragments of melodies that felt familiar in a deep, bone-aching way. It started with a snippet of an old folk tune, one your grandfather might have hummed while fixing something in the garage. Just 4 or 5 notes, tucked into the flowing river of his own composition. Then came a phrase from a lullaby that seemed to exist in every culture, a simple, rocking pattern that spoke of safety and sleep. He wasn't playing these songs straight. He was using them like colors, dipping his brush in memories that weren't just his own, but belonged to everyone. He played a progression that sounded like the end of a long, heartfelt talk with an old friend. Then a high, clear run of notes. That was pure, childlike wonder, the kind you feel seeing the first star at twilight. The violinist followed him perfectly, his bow dancing or weeping on the strings as the story demanded. He heard the folk tune fragment and echoed it, adding a rustic, mournful twist that made it sound even older. When the piano hinted at the lullaby, the violin became the gentle hand on the forehead, smoothing out the worry. A woman in a business suit, clutching a tablet computer to her chest like a shield, felt her stern expression crumble. That folk tune? Her father, a tough, quiet man who had passed 2 winters ago, used to whistle it while he made pancakes on Sunday mornings. She hadn't thought of it in years. The memory didn't come as a picture, but as a feeling, the smell of coffee and batter, the sound of that off-key whistle, the warmth of the kitchen. A sob hitched in her breath, surprising her. She bit her lip, but the tears came anyway, silent and hot. Near the front, a construction worker in dusty boots, still holding his yellow hard hat, was staring at the pianist's hands. The music had just shifted into something broader, more open, a series of chords that sounded like wide, empty fields under a big sky. It was the exact feeling he got driving home to the countryside after a month of loud city work. It was the feeling of space, of belonging somewhere. His eyes, tired from looking at concrete and steel, welled up. He missed home so badly it was. A physical ache, and this stranger was playing the sound of it. The music was doing something incredible. It was bypassing minds and speaking directly to hearts. It was tapping into a shared well of human experience, loss, hope, memory, longing for home, the ghost of childhood comfort. Everyone in the crowd was hearing the same notes, but they were each painting their own private, vivid pictures with them. The young mother, her baby now fast asleep against her, was somewhere else entirely. The lullaby notes had melted into a warmer, more solid melody. It sounded like strong arms holding you, like a promise that everything would be okay. It was. The feeling she'd been desperately trying to give her baby, and now, for the first time all day, she was receiving it herself from this unknown musician. She cried quiet tears of gratitude, rocking gently. The student on the floor had her forehead pressed to her knees. The music had moved from her anxiety to something else. It had a determined, climbing quality now. It was about struggle. Yes, but it was about the strength to keep going. It was the musical version of getting knocked down and standing back up, again and again. It acknowledged her fear, and then told her she was stronger than it. She wiped her nose on the sleeve of her puffy coat, a new, fragile sense of calm settling over her. Then the music changed once more. The piano and violin softened, pulling back until they were almost just a whisper. The man's fingers drifted into the opening notes of a popular love song from about 20 years ago. It wasn't a cheesy, overplayed one. It was a specific, beautiful song about a love that was simple and real, about growing old together. He didn't play the whole thing. He just played the heartbreakingly sweet chorus, slowly, tenderly, letting each note hang in the air like a precious thing. And this was the note that broke the dam. The elderly man on the bench, waiting for his army friend, let out a sound that was half a sigh, half a moan. That song, his wife. She had loved that song. They danced to it in their tiny living room 1,000 times. She was gone 5 years now. The memory of her, of the weight of her hand in his, of the smell of her perfume, crashed over him with a force that stole his breath. He covered his face with his large, weathered hands, and his shoulders began to shake. He wept not with sadness alone, but with the overwhelming presence of a love that death could not erase. Seeing him, others could no longer hold back. The businesswoman let the tablet droop in her lap, her body shaking with silent cries. The construction worker let the tears roll freely down his dust-streaked cheeks, not bothering to wipe them. A teenage boy, trying so hard to look cool and unaffected, turned his face away, blinking rapidly, his throat tight. It wasn't loud, wailing, sobbing. It was a quiet rain. It was the sound of 100 private battles being acknowledged at once. 100 hearts, hardened by the daily grind, softened and cracked open by beauty and recognition. They cried for lost parents, for lost loves, for personal failures, for missed chances, for the sheer, exhausting weight of being alive. And they also cried, strangely, from relief. The relief of not being alone in those feelings. The relief of having them witnessed, honored, and transformed into something beautiful. Right here in this dirty, magical, public place, the man at the piano heard it. The soft, collective sigh of release. The sniffles. The shuddering breaths. He peeked, just for a second, from behind his closed eyelids. He saw the sea of faces, glistening with tears, utterly captivated, utterly broken open. And in that moment, his own experiment vanished. His cynicism melted away. This wasn't data anymore. This was human beings, connecting in the most raw and real way possible. A profound understanding hit him, as clear as one of his own notes. This was what he had been missing. This was the real connection his digital world could only ever mimic. It was messy, it was unplanned, it was happening in real time with real tears and real risk. And it was the most truthful thing he had ever been a part of. A fresh wave of emotion, different from his grief, washed over him. It was humility. And love, a vast, aching love for these strangers sharing their hearts with him. He poured it all back into the keys. The music swelled again, the violin rising with it, but now it was different. The sorrow was still there, but it was being lifted, carried by something stronger. It was transforming. It became a song of compassion, a hymn for the broken and the brave, a soundtrack for every person in that station who had ever loved, ever lost, and ever gotten up the next morning to try again. The bubble of shared emotion had grown to encompass nearly the entire concourse. People stood 3 and 4 deep, silent except for their crying. They were no longer a crowd of individuals. They were a temporary community, bound together by the invisible, powerful threads of a song they all felt was, somehow, just for them. The music was now a living thing, a shared breath between the man at the piano, the young violinist, and the silent, weeping crowd. It had built to a peak of such overwhelming feeling that it seemed it couldn't possibly go any higher. And then it did. The pianist leaned into the keyboard, his whole body flowing into the movement. His left hand laid down deep, resonant chords that vibrated up through the floor. His right hand danced across the high notes, a cascade of sound that was both desperate and hopeful, like someone clutching at light in a dark room. The violin soared alongside it, no longer just an accompaniment, but a twin voice, crying out the same beautiful, painful truth. Together, they created a sound that was bigger than the station, bigger than the city. It was the sound of a human heart, amplified to its fullest volume, every love, every regret, every quiet dream given a voice. In the front row of this impromptu audience stood a woman in her late 20s. She had been on her way to a job interview, clutching her portfolio with damp, nervous hands. She worked as a junior graphic designer for the tech giant Ether. The music had stopped her in her tracks 20 minutes ago, and she had been crying softly ever since, her interview forgotten. But as this final, magnificent crescendo built, her tears slowed. Her professional mind, trained to notice details, began to tick over again, cutting through the fog of emotion. There was something about the way the man played, the specific, fluid crossing of his hands, the unusual, intricate pattern he was using in the bass notes. It was a style, a fingerprint. And then she remembered. 6 months ago, before the founder's retreat from public life, there had been a small internal Ether company gathering. It was for long-time employees. She'd been in the very back of the room. The CEO, a figure as distant to her as a movie star, had been persuaded to say a few words. He'd been quite humble. And then, to everyone's shock, he'd sat down at a piano they'd rented for the party. He'd played a short, improvised piece. It wasn't polished, but it was stunning in its emotion. She remembered the video, shot on a shaky phone that had leaked internally. The tech blogs had speculated about it for a week, reclusive billionaire's hidden talent. But it had soon been buried by other news. The piece he played at that party, it had this same core, this same haunting heart. And the way his head tilted slightly to the left when he was lost in the music, her eyes, red from crying, went wide. She stared. The plain gray coat, the ordinary tired face. But the hands. She looked at the hands flying over the keys with a fierce, controlled grace. Coder's hands. Piano hands. His hands. Her breath caught. A jolt went through her that had nothing to do with the music. She leaned over to the elderly man sitting on the bench next to her, who was still wiping his eyes with a handkerchief. "That's," she whispered, her voice hoarse. I think that's him." The old man blinked, not understanding. "Who, dear?" She could barely say it. It felt like blasphemy to break the spell with a name, with a title from that other noisy world. "The man from Ether," she breathed, almost soundlessly. "The one who built it. That's him." The old man looked from her shocked face back to the pianist. The billionaire? Here? It seemed impossible. But the young woman's certainty was absolute. He didn't shout. He just nodded slowly, a new layer of awe settling over his grief-stricken features. He tapped the shoulder of the construction worker in front of him, leaned in, and passed it on in a hushed murmur. Like a gentle ripple across a still pond, the knowledge spread. Not as a scream, but as a sacred secret. A whisper from one tear-stained face to another. Asterisk, that's Leo Thorne. Asterisk, asterisk, it's the Ether guy. Asterisk, asterisk, the founder. Asterisk, the effect was extraordinary. The crying didn't stop. If anything, for some, it intensified. But it changed. The emotion was now woven with a stunned, profound reverence. This wasn't just a talented stranger. This was a man who had shaped the modern world, a king from a kingdom of light and code who had chosen to walk among them as a pauper. He had chosen this old piano, these tired people, this raw and messy communion over all the power and isolation his wealth could buy. The young violinist felt the shift in the crowd's energy. He didn't know the specifics, but he sensed the awe, the collective intake of breath. He played on, his own playing becoming more intense, as if he understood he was sharing this moment with a master, not just a fellow street musician. Back at the piano, Leo Thorne was reaching the end. He had poured everything out. The memory of his wife was no longer a sharp pain in this moment, but a warm, golden light filling him. The faces of the crying strangers were no longer subjects of an experiment. They were his friends, his confidants, the recipients of his most honest confession. The crescendo could not be sustained forever. With a master's control, he began to guide it down. The violin followed, its last notes fading into a sigh. The complicated, emotional storm of music simplified. It distilled into a pure, repeating melody, the very first simple theme he had played when he sat down. It had come home. He played it softly, with a tenderness that made every heart ache. It was a lullaby after the storm. A promise. A goodbye. He opened his eyes. They were clear and calm. He looked out at the crowd, really looked at them for the first time. He saw the tears, the shared whispers, the looks of stunned recognition on some faces. He didn't seem surprised they knew. In that moment, it didn't matter. All that mattered was the connection that hummed in the air between them, thick and real as the station's smell of dust and rain. He gave them a small, humble nod. It wasn't a bow. It wasn't a performer acknowledging applause. It was one person saying thank you to others. Thank you for listening. Thank you for feeling it with me. Thank you for being human with me, Dot. His hand slowed. The left hand played one last, deep, grounding chord. The right hand finished the simple melody on a single, high, clear note. It hung in the air, pristine and perfect, for what felt like an eternity. Then he lifted his fingers from the keys. The silence that followed was the most powerful sound any of them had ever heard. It wasn't empty. It was full. It was packed with every ounce of emotion that had just been unleashed. No one clapped. Clapping would have been wrong, like applauding a prayer or a sunset. The only sounds were the distant, forgotten rumble of the station and the soft, shaky sounds of people breathing through their tears. He sat there for just a few more seconds, letting the silence settle. He looked at the worn photograph he had tucked into the piano's music stand at some point during the performance. He smiled at it, a true, peaceful smile. Then he carefully picked it up and placed it back into his coat pocket, over his heart. He stood up. The piano stool scraped softly on the floor. He gave the instrument a gentle pat on its side, as if thanking an old friend. Then, without a word, he turned and stepped away from the piano. The crowd, a solid wall of people, did something incredible. They didn't surge forward. They didn't ask for selfies or shout his name. They understood, instinctively, that the magic required his departure. As he walked slowly towards the exit, they simply parted. A quiet pathway opened for him. They looked at him as he passed, not with the frenzy of seeing a celebrity, but with the quiet, tearful gratitude of people who had been given a profound gift. He walked through them, his head down, hands back in his pockets, just the man in the gray coat again. And then he was gone, swallowed by the shifting crowds heading for the eastbound exits. He left behind a transformed space, and several hundred transformed people, standing in a silence that still echoed with the memory of every note. For a long moment, no one moved. The silence was a blanket, heavy and warm, covering the space where the music had been. It was a silence that felt respectful, necessary, like the quiet in a great hall after a final, perfect word has been spoken. The young violinist slowly lowered his instrument, the bow trembling slightly in his hand. He looked at the empty piano stool, then at the faces around him, all glistening and soft. He gave a small, bewildered shake of his head, a smile touching his lips. He hadn't played for money. He had played for that. He carefully put his violin away, the ordinary sounds of the case clicking shut strangely loud in the quiet. Then the spell began to gently dissolve, not with a crash, but with a slow, soft waking. People blinked, as if emerging from a deep sleep. They looked at each other, really looked, perhaps for the first time. They saw their own tears mirrored on other faces, on the face of the tough construction worker, on the stern businesswoman, on the tired young mother. And instead of feeling embarrassed, they felt a strange, instant kinship. A man in a suit offered his clean handkerchief to the elderly man on the bench, who was still composing himself. The older man took it with a nod, his grip on the other. Man's hand lingering for a second in shared understanding. The young mother, her baby still sleeping peacefully, caught the eye of the student, who was now wiping her face on her coat sleeve. They didn't speak. The mother just offered a tired, tear-streaked smile that said, "I know. Me too." Student smiled back, a real unguarded smile that reached her eyes for the first time in weeks. The crowd didn't disperse like a normal crowd. It unraveled slowly, reluctantly. People lingered, not wanting to break the connection. The businesswoman with the tablet tucked it under her arm, her earlier urgency completely gone. She walked over to the coffee kiosk and on an impulse bought 2 hot chocolates. She walked back and handed one to the security guard, who was still holding his hat over his heart. He looked surprised, then nodded his thanks, taking the cup with both hands. No one pulled out a phone, not a single person. In those first minutes, it was as if they had all made a silent pact. To record this, to try and capture it, would have been to shrink it, to put it back in the very digital box the man in the gray coat had been questioning. This was for them, a secret shared between strangers. The young ether employee, the one who had recognized the pianist, finally took a shuddering breath. She looked at her watch. Her job interview was in 15 minutes, across town. An hour ago, it had been the most important thing in her world. Now, it felt different, smaller. She thought about the raw honesty in her boss's music. She thought about the portfolio in her hand, filled with designs meant to grab attention for a few seconds. She wanted to make things that made people feel the way she felt right now. Not for clicks, but for this. She turned and walked towards her train, her steps lighter, her purpose somehow clearer. Slowly, the station's normal noise began to seep back in. The announcement for the 10:15 to the coast crackled over the speakers. A suitcase wheel squeaked, but the sound was different now. It wasn't an annoying roar. It was just the background hum of life continuing. The people who had been part of this circle finally began to move towards their platforms, their destinations. But they carried something with them. The construction worker put his hard hat back on, the ghost of that wide-open field music still in his ears. He pulled out his phone, not to scroll, but to call his sister out in the countryside. "Hey," he said when she answered, his voice rough. "Just heard some music that made me think of home. How are you?" The elderly man's friend finally arrived, apologizing for the delay. He found his old comrade not annoyed, but serene, with red-rimmed eyes. "You okay, mate?" the friend asked, concerned. The older man just put a hand on his friend's shoulder. "More than okay," he said, his voice thick. "Let's go eat. I have so much to tell you." The story of what happened had spread, but not in the way most stories do in the modern world. It spread the old way. Through words. The young violinist met a friend for lunch later that day. "You will not believe what just happened," he said, his eyes still bright with the memory. The businesswoman got home that evening, and instead of turning on the TV, sat with her husband. "Something beautiful happened today," she began. The student, back in her tiny apartment, video called her parents. She didn't talk about her exams first. She said, "Mom, Dad, I heard this piano today, and I cried, and it was okay." It was the ether employee who finally connected the dots for the wider world. That night, she wrote a long post on an internal company forum. Not a lick, but a personal essay. She didn't write about the billionaire. She wrote about the man in the gray coat. She wrote about the crying construction worker, and the sleeping baby, and the shared silence. She wrote about the feeling of 100 private walls coming down at once. Her words were so honest, so powerful, that the post was screenshotted and shared. It found its way to a few thoughtful culture websites. The headline wasn't "Billionaire Plays Piano." It was "The Day a City Station Remembered How to Feel." Leo Thorne saw the article. He read it in the quiet of his home, a home that felt a little less empty than before. He read about the ripples the phone calls made, the conversation started, the small acts of kindness sparked by his music. He hadn't just received an answer to his experiment. He had been flooded with it. The connection wasn't in the network servers. It was in the old man calling his friend. It was in the hot chocolate given to a guard. It was in the student feeling strong enough to face her books. It was real, it was messy, and it was alive. He never made a public statement about it. He didn't need to. But those who worked closely with him at Ether began to notice subtle shifts. A new priority on features that encouraged small, genuine groups over vast, noisy crowds. A company-wide initiative to create more quiet corners in their digital spaces. A focus on the quality of connection, not just the quantity. Back at the station, life went on. Trains came and went. The coffee kiosk did a brisk business. And the old public piano sat by its pillar, waiting. But now, sometimes, people would pause beside it. They would remember. And sometimes, someone else, a teenager, a grandmother, an office worker on their lunch break, would sit down. They wouldn't play a famous song. They would play something simple, something true. And often, just for a minute or two, a few people would stop their rushing. They would listen. And they might feel a little less alone, reminded of the day a stranger played a song that turned a train station into a church and proved that the most powerful thing in the world is a human heart, heard by another.